Hey, what's cracking everyone? My name is Ryan, and today I will be reciting my review of the Meze Poet to all of you, and hold my head in shame because you all now think I'm so very lame. But before you judge me, just know this Poet right here, for me, was a bit of a miss. The Poet is an open back planar magnetic headphone from Meze Audio, and it retails in for $2,000. Now, this headphone was sent to me as part of a reviewer's tour from Meze, and I've not been asked to do anything other than give my honest thoughts and opinions on this headphone. I do also want to send a big thanks to Meze for including me on this tour. The Poet comes with a more than satisfactory unboxing experience, in my opinion. You will get the headphone nestled inside of this black latching headphone suitcase. Also inside the case is a very pretty and detailed booklet covering the design and technicalities behind the Poet. It's a really nice touch and adds to the experience. Lastly, I can't forget to mention the cable. Included is a premium dual 3.5 hand-braided copper cable that terminates to a 6.3 single-ended connection and is pretty long and a thick boy. This is a pretty dope cable. I'm excited to see Meze continuing to do this and putting care into an important component to any headphone that other companies really need to take note of. I mean, it adds to the hi-fi, man. Hey, quick 10-second plug to remind you to like, subscribe, and consider my Patreon to support the channel. Now, let's get back to the video. Now, I say this in pretty much every Meze headphone review, but the build is nothing short of an impressive collection of quality materials. It features a magnesium chassis with a steel grille on the cups. The grille is copper in its color and shows off the intricate patterns that are purposeful in fine-tuning the sound of the Poet. The head strap up top is made of soft suede, and new to Meze is the Dan Clark style of headband that is titanium alloy. Now, this won't be the last time you'll hear me reference Dan Clark audio in this video, by the way. Returning for the Poet that was first found on the Lyric 2 are the magnetized pads that are made up of artificial leather on the surface and Alcantara on the interior. They are extremely soft and easily replaced if and when that time comes for you. As for the fit and comfort, you do get full cup swivel and a bit of a refined tilt system here versus the Lyric 2. The Lyric 2 had sort of an odd spring back to the tilt that actually made them more difficult to couple to my head, and also an unappealing look on some headphone stands. On the Poet, the tilt is not so springy and gives me a tight seal every time I put them on. Now, this is what happens when a company listens to feedback from the consumers. Well done, Meze. Now, in total, the Poet weighs in at 405 grams, so not light as a feather, but it's evenly distributed, and I didn't have any discomfort ever over time. The only possible issue I see is with the narrow type of pads and solid surface of the artificial leather. These could get a bit warmer in the hotter months of the year. And they almost gave me a suction cup type sensation when I do get a good tight seal and I pop them off my head. Another area where the Poet has a slight departure would be on the driver technology. The isodynamic hybrid array driver used on the Poet is a new design that utilizes both the Lyric and Elite drivers used. They are calling this one the Renaro MZ6, where the former were the MZ4 and the MZ3 SE. Kind of feels like a Mission Impossible James Bond type naming. Renaro is the facility in Ukraine where the drivers are hand-assembled and have been a staple in producing the drivers for Meze headphones. Something that is very important to note here is the inclusion of the AMTS technology that has been licensed from Dan Clark Audio. See? In fact, you'll see it stamped right on the driver housing inside when looking behind the pads. The AMTS is supposed to help reduce higher frequency peaks and make this a less fatiguing experience. It does this by covering up the openings in the driver frame to basically refine those treble peaks I spoke of. I find it a very interesting implementation for Meze to use, and I'm about to tell you how I hear it in practice. But before I do that, I should mention that this driver is 55 ohms of impedance and has a sensitivity of 101 dB of SPL per milliwatt. I've mostly listened to the Poet on one main amp that I own. Before I tell you that amp, I should mention that I do think synergy is going to play an important role here. This isn't necessarily the pickiest of headphones depending on the amps used, but it's enough that it will make a difference. For instance, I listened on the Schiit Midgard and Modia stack and just didn't really care for the sound that I was getting. I did use the XLR Halo topology, and yeah, it's hard to explain exactly, but it was just a bit unappealing of a sound to me. Not as lively and lacking a bit on the technical performance. So then I tried them on the IHA-8 from Cayin, paired up to the Cyan 2 DAC from Holo. This was definitely a more technical listen, along with good overall performance. Still, I couldn't help but feel something was missing for what I was wanting. So then I moved on to the HA-3A, which is a transformer coupled tube amplifier, and paired that up to the Cyan 2, and eureka! This is my preferred pairing with this headphone. The reason being, it gave a tonality a bit more weight and texture, while also giving a nice holographic image with a touch of extra warmth. Still, it's important to say, nothing necessarily changed the sound signature of the Poet, but different pairings can highlight or even fade out aspects of the frequency response. I don't find the Poet overly difficult to drive as it pertains to getting enough volume, but getting a bit more juice can always assist with planar magnetic drivers. So experiment away, if you can. Oh, and my HA-3A is using the Horizon series of PS Vane 12 AU7 tubes, just for reference. If you watched my Can Jam recap video, you would have known that I didn't have the best feedback when I listened to the Poet. I mean, I wouldn't say thumbs up, thumbs down, I would say thumbs to the side, right? Just kind of, I don't know. Now, since then, I've had quite a bit more time with this headphone, and I've come to terms with what it is that doesn't really speak to me, but hey, it may speak to you. Or you. The Poet starts off with this pretty linear sub-bass response, if not a touch rolled off to my ears. But then it will give you a bit of an impact into the mid-bass region that won't disrupt or corrupt the mid-range. Then the mid-range feels somewhat neutral throughout and perhaps a bit lean as well at times, but elevates as it moves up the frequency response. I hear this elevation and that attack range because I do feel some good punchiness in the mids. It takes another turn as it moves into the presence region and is more of a blade back sound for many vocalists and doesn't provide a ton of clarity to my ears. It's got a nice and sweet warmth to the treble. However, it has a good amount of airiness that I picked up. This lends to a pretty clear picture that provides good depth and layering. It's an interesting and a bit different of a tuning that I've come to appreciate, even if it isn't for me. I'm gonna change it up a bit this time and just highlight a few tracks that will showcase the sound signature I just spoke of. The first track is Lost Without You by Freya Writings. This is a singer-songwriter focused track that I found interesting on the Poet. Her vocals do have good body to them, and it's definitely the focus of the track. Around the 1 minute and 30 mark of the track, the piano becomes more emphasized and demanding in the mix. I actually found it competing with her vocals almost too much at times to where the attack of the keys distracted me a bit. This is also where volume can be key. Yes, pun intended. Because more boosting here can magnify just enough to almost feel unbalanced. Now I did pick this concert hall type reverberation up of her vocals that were beautifully distributed throughout as well. And I think it's worth mentioning that her voice is going to be flattering on many different types of headphones and speakers. Now another track I want to discuss is Mr. Blue Sky by the Electric Light Orchestra. Now I'll cut right to the chase on this one and discuss the fire hydrant clang that is pretty iconic for this track. If you know any history on the song, you'll know that I mean that quite literally as they bang on a fire hydrant to get that cowbell-like sound. This is another example of a dip in the mid-range where that cowbell-like clang is a bit more difficult to decipher. It's more like a ping, and it's a bit of a recession in the range to show some variations in the tuning. Once again, boosting and volume may pick it out more, but it will also exaggerate the rest of the mix and probably isn't the best idea to do that. Now, what would a track example be if I didn't focus on bass response at least once through this review? To highlight that, I'll discuss Change on the Rise by Avi Kaplan. This track from the very start will have this thump of a drum throughout. On the Poet, I hear it, and I know it's there, but it's just not very present. There isn't a lot of added thickness to the low sub-bass region of the Poet. The lack of that thickness can almost give a lean feeling in that part of the bass. The good news is you will get attack and some slam thanks to that bump in the mid-bass when it hits. It just doesn't quite have a lot of sustain to it. Now, I wouldn't call this headphone bass-light by any means. It's just not overly thick and the most present for my taste. Finally, to top things off, literally, we'll discuss the top end of the treble. Now, I do find this to have a finesse to the upper treble that doesn't bother me at all. The track Speak Softly Love by Yao Si Ting may not be a prime example of upper treble, but it did punctuate a sweetness again to the treble that softened sibilance that could have been picked up on others. Her voice didn't project any of that with the Poet, and this was probably my favorite pairing to listen to this track. Her vocals had plenty of focus once again, and the violin in the back was just poetic in its subtlety. Now, I don't find the Poet to be overly wide when it comes to space, but it can portray depth and imaging very well. I refer back to that concert hall type experience I can pick up with vocals, and it happens with the instrumentals as well. So a couple of other things to note that I picked up with the Poet. Male vocals seem to generally have less of an emphasis with the Poet versus females. I noticed this much more with heavy rock or metal music especially. I gotta say that I didn't really care for gaming with this headphone either, for those that, care to know. Personally, I just want a bit more excitement in the low end and perhaps a bit more staging as well for my immersiveness. Finally, and interestingly enough, I was discussing the Poet in a Discord server and someone else had a bit of a different experience and thought the treble at times had a bit of sizzle to it. This is where age and tolerances can really show up from person to person. It's also why I always recommend getting opinions from more than just one source. Right? So I was trying to think of a good contrast when comparing to the Poet, and my Aria Organic instantly came to mind. Even though it's about half the price of the Poet, it still performs very well for a planar. I'd say if you don't like how bright the Aria can be, or maybe that it's got that forwardness to the mids, then perhaps the Poet would suit you as a good contrast to this headphone. I also think the Organic has more of a lower slam to the bass, where the Poet has more mid-bass focus. I think it's also interesting to compare the Poet to quite a few headphones that are now stepping into this price range, such as the Aria Unveiled and newly launched Abyss Joel. The good news is that the Poet isn't quite like other headphones I've heard as of late. So if it's differences you're going for, this may just be one to consider. I should also mention that this is not simply an open back version of the Lyric 2, in case you were wondering. So in wrapping things up with the Poet, I want to make a couple of points here. First off, this is not a sound signature that I enjoy. I would like more clarity and a bit more energetic of a sound for my taste. My second point is that who the hell cares if this is a sound that I enjoy? I mean, seriously, I do want to give Meze credit where it's due, and that they didn't just go with the flow when tuning the Poet. In my opinion, this one's different, and I do think there is going to be a solid demand for a tuning like this. It's got character in places that others would not have it. I've also heard through some talk that this can be fun to try with an OTL tube amp that I unfortunately do not yet have at the moment, but soon, Valhalla 3, soon. Now, I'd like to know in the comments down below your thoughts on the Poet. Have you tried it? Do you own it? Do you whisper sweet nothings to it? Let me know, and let me know how my poetry is while you're at it. No, actually, please don't do that, haters. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.